So Dr. Pia Lane is professor of multilingualism at the Center of Multilingualism in Society across the lifespan at the University of Oslo in Norway. Her research focuses on multilingualism in northern Norway, with a particular emphasis on language policy, language shift, and language revitalization in relation to indigenous and minoritized languages. Her publications include standardizing minority languages, competing ideologies of authority and authenticity in the global periphery, co-edited with James Costa and Haley DeCorn. That's 2017. And negotiating identities in Northern migrant narratives, crossing borders and telling lives. That's 2022. She's also co-editor-in-chief of Linguistic Minorities in Europe Online, published by the Gruyter, and serves also as a member of the Norwegian Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So welcome, Pia. It's our honor to have you with us, and over to you.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I've been looking forward to this. I've watched a lot of these sessions on your YouTube channel. And of course, I've heard from my colleague Rafael, who is also in Oslo. So I look forward to getting feedback and to discuss some of these ideas with you. I hope that you now see my screen. There are always these technicalities that are a bit, there we go. Now you should see the full picture. This is the tricky part with PowerPoints on Zoom. You've always got to check that everything is in order.
Yes, we can see it perfectly.
You can see it. So as I page, please stop me if for some reason there's a lag in the system, or if you don't hear the sound when I play movie clips and sound recordings. I added a little bit to my title in the program. It says the North and the South in the North, language reclamation and silences, but I added language shift because I realized that that is a large part of what I'm going to be talking about. I won't go into a long sort of discussion on the relationship between language revitalization and language reclamation, but I often use the term language reclamation for two reasons. So in line with Wesley Leonard, that reclamation encompasses the group's sort of agency and the right to self-determination and make their own choices. And I also like the term reclamation because to me it focuses on the individual experiences, which is sort of what I am in the process of exploring. So this is a very well-known quote, I think, for all of you. So the South is not a geographical concept, even though the great majority of these populations live in countries of the Southern Hemisphere. The South is here rather a metaphor of the human suffering caused by capitalism and colonialism at the global level, and a metaphor as well of the resistance to overcome or minimize such suffering. It is therefore an anti-capitalist, anti-colonialist, and anti-imperialist South. It is a South that also exists in the global North in the form of excluded, silenced, and marginalized populations, such as undocumented immigrants, the unemployed, ethnic or religious minorities, and victims of sexism, homophobia, and racism. So in my presentation, I want to take you on a journey. So what you can see where the arrow points is to my home community in Northern Norway. I grew up in a trilingual family where Kven, a Finnic language, was the dominant language. Sami was also spoken, but all children were spoken to in Norwegian only. In the beginning of my career, most of my publications were sort of standard academic publications where I describe the background of the community and the history. And then I moved on to analyze interview data. And about 12 years ago, I have colleagues at a university in Northern Norway, and they had worked on reading some of my articles. And they commented that I had hidden myself and my own voice. So I was absent, even though I had lived through, both me and my family had lived through everything that I described. So I kept sort of battling with this in my mind for quite a while. How can I find theories and a way of writing that would make it possible for me to write about this? And I have, of course, been inspired by indigenous scholars and also scholars who draw on Southern perspectives. And like Linda Tuhiwai-Smith, I was born in one world and educated in another. So I was educated in a world first at school where our background was invisible. And then I went through an academic training where I silenced my own voice in my writings. So I have only recently started writing in a different way, where I try to include some of my experiences as a form of data and a way of thinking. So you will hear about two groups of people. Well, we're not really that different or that they're not two neat categories, because the Kven and Sami people have intermarried, as is the case of my family. And I only discovered as an adult that actually the ancestors on my grandfather's side, they were all Sami. So it's we all have this intertwined mixed heritage. But for simplicity's sake, I've split it in two groups. So the Kven are protected under two charters or conventions under the auspices of the Council of Europe. The Council of Europe is not the same as the European Union. The Council of Europe was founded at the end after the Second World War to promote democracy, human rights, and the rule of law in Europe. Sami is also protected by the same two charters, but in addition by the ILO Convention 169, so they are recognized as an indigenous people in Norway. They both belong to the Finno-Ugric language family. So they are very different from Norwegian and English. Sami and Kven are not mutually intelligible, but if you know the one, it's easy to learn the other one. So the Kven are a minority group in northern Norway. So our ancestors came from what today is northern Finland and northern Sweden. And there were seasonal migrations. And then when the nation-state borders were finalized in Europe, or in this Nordic part of Europe in the 19th century, then these peoples were split between different countries, both the Kven and the Sami people. Norway recognized Kven as a language and not just a dialect of Finnish in 2005. So you will see when we get to my data that that people often refer to their language as Finnish. But just to make it clear from the outset that I do not talk about Finnish in Finland. So some people call their language Kven, others call it like our Finnish or old Finnish. So that's why the data snippets are like that. I just wanted to play a short excerpt of a documentary movie. So you will now get to hear a bit of Kven, and at the end you will also get to hear a bit of Sami. So this is a movie that was made by a movie company called Light Source Productions. And in this movie, the pilot for the movie, they speak both Norwegian and Kven. I don't think I will play all of it for you because it is 7 minutes. But we can return to it if we run out of questions in the question and in the discussion session.
Ja, jeg er av et folk, et språk som ingen vet noe om. Og liksom det er ikke ja, hva er det for noe? Det er liksom det er noe skjult. Det er noe det er liksom det hemmelige folket, det hemmelige språket.
Mutta ja sitten oli, en tiedä mikä se suomeksi on, mutta Marit. Minun oli joka ainoa yö illalla, mien tohtinut mennä sänkyyn, sillä kun nämä unet tultiin. Missä mie näin haudat, kirkon maa, missä on haudat, ne on auki ja siinä seisovat ihmiset, joita mie tiedän kekkoon. Joka yö sen.
I think it froze. That was probably a sign that we should move on. There was a beautiful song there that I wanted to play for you. Perhaps I'll make another attempt just for that section. Oop.
Se ovat ihmiset, joita mitään. Joka yön, se kesti monta vuotta. Ja sitten huomasin sen, että mä olin yhdessä kirjakaupassa, oliko se täällä Lemmiössä vai oliko Alatiossa. Huomasin sen, että siinä oli kirja Drömmetydning. Ja aukasen näin. Ja siinä lukee, vad drömmer du om? Drömmer du om åpne graver?
Yeah, these technicalities are not always good.
Vad drömmer du om? Drömmer du om åpne graver? Ja siinä tuli vastaus. Ja Marritit jätettiin minuun. Du är på jakt efter din identitet.
Ja taivas kattoonani. Maa on musta mun jalkain alla. Ja taivas kattoonani.
If any of you would like to watch the full pilot, I would be very happy to send you a link via email later, so you can just contact me. I was preparing for another lecture last semester, a lecture on language shift. And then I went back to some recordings that I had used for an earlier project, and started looking at the transcriptions and reanalyzing them. And then I came across a segment in one of them that I hadn't noticed before. I have two sets of data. So about 14 people were interviewed in 1975, and then 69 were interviewed. Of these 69, 14 were re-interviewed in 2008. So I found the interview with my mother from 1975. And she was actually interviewed on my first day of school. So there were Finnish ethnologists who traveled up to talk to these Finnic brothers and sisters in northern Norway. The languages are basically mutually intelligible. We have some differences in vocabulary. So what they are saying isn't that important, but what is interesting is that this researcher interviews my mother, and I'm there with her. That was the way when things were when we grew up. Children were with everywhere, at work and at home, and we would be present when the adults were there. I understood Kven, but I was only spoken to in Norwegian. So you can actually see here that little me, who's 7 years old, I'm sort of interjecting and asking questions while my mother is talking to this Finnish researcher.
Teidän isä on ollut kalastaja ja vielä Teidän isä on kalastaja ollut. Onko hänellä oma vene?
On. Tämmöinen pieni.
Joo. Se on ilmeisesti viime vuosina tullut kannattavammaksi tämä kalastus.
Se tuli klokkasen här.
Joo.
Se tuli klokkasen här.
So you can see what I have marked in red. This is what we say in Norwegian. So my mother, even though being engaged in this conversation with the Finnish researcher, she speaks Norwegian only to me. So I realized when I re-listened to this that, wow, I'm actually now listening to the language shift that happened in my home community. We were spoken to in Norwegian only, even though that wasn't, whatever you choose to call it, dominant language or mother tongue of any of the adults in the village, apart from the teachers who often came from the outside. This has led me to think about silencing, which is something that I am exploring in several publications at the moment. So the first and perhaps most obvious was the silencing by the nation state. If you wonder what the background is, those are the Arctic or Northern Lights in the north, the Aurora Borealis. So Norway wanted to Norwegianize the northern minorities, so the Sami and Kven people. And ownership of land, the educational systems and religion were the main tools in this process. So what you see here, all these photos are from my home municipality. This is a boarding school, and a lot of Kven and Sami children were sent to boarding schools where all the teaching was in Norwegian, and they were often quite far away from their families. Land was given to settlers from southern parts of Norway in order to establish a Norwegian presence. And Norwegian-style churches were built in the area, often following Norwegian architecture styles. You can see here with the dragon's heads, sort of Viking symbolism on the church. So this is somebody from another village in my area who was interviewed. So she said, I'll read this to you in English. She was interviewed in Kven. And when we went to school here in Busujoki, we lived in a boarding school. This was a hellish time. Hui. Small children there at the boarding school there. There was no mother and no father. This wasn't a good time. She actually called it later in the interview. She says that it was a hellish time, actually, which is a stronger word in Kven than it is in Finnish. There were a range of policies put into place. So first, there was a teaching directive that limited the use of Kven and Sami as supporting languages. Then from 1851 to 1921, there was the so-called Finne Fond, which was a way of supporting teachers who had success in making children speak Norwegian. It should be noted that approximately 50% of the school children are more or less influenced by the foreign languages, in particular Kven, and that they, as small children with love, reach to their mother tongue as means for communication. But one notes with joy that when they leave elementary school, the Norwegian language is their most valued possession. It shouldn't be possession. And then towards the end of the 19th century, there were a range of regulations and directives put into place. The most well-known is the so-called Vekselsen Decree. Even though the majority of the school children in the school district do not understand Norwegian, the teachers shall keep these instructions in mind and remember that it is imperative that the Lappish and Kven languages are not used apart from when circumstances make it absolutely unavoidable. The Land Sales Act that was implemented in 1902 and formally only abolished in 1964, there was a regulation or amendment to the law that stated sales may take place to Norwegian citizens only, and with a particular view to furthering the settlement of a population that is suitable for the district, for its cultivation, and for its utilization in other ways, that can speak, read, and write the Norwegian language and that use it for their everyday tongue. So all these policies had a very negative impact on Kven and Sami languages and cultures. In addition, at the end of the Second World War, when the Nazi army retreated, everything was burnt, and 70,000 people were forcibly evacuated. Often, most of them to southern Norway, where they met a culture and a language that wasn't that well known to them, and they were seen as foreign and different. In terms of language, what is also important was that all material culture, including written texts and letters and books, were also burnt. So basically everything was burnt to the ground. After the Second World War, the Nordic countries, and particularly Norway and Sweden, were characterized by social Darwinism. So a widespread belief in what Dorian described as a social Darwinism of language as well, encouraging people of European background to assume a correlation between adaptive and expressive capacity in a language and that language's survival and spread. So assuming that languages spread not because of the social and economic power of the speakers, but because these languages are particularly suited for rational thought. And in the Norwegian context, the Norwegian authorities saw this language as Norwegian. Social Darwinism also has longer roots in Norway. It encompassed also a very strong cultural perspective where they sort of saw Norwegians as being on top, followed then by the Kven and the Sami people at the bottom. So a number of Sami graves were open and skulls were taken out. So you can see on the map here, this is the Norwegian Broadcasting Company published this. So all these circles are maps, are marked Sami graves. So my home village is here. This is an excavation carried out by the University of Oslo in my home municipality. So they opened Sami graves and took primarily skulls, but also other body parts to the University of Oslo. 96 skulls were reburied in September 2011, so just a bit more than 10 years ago. This is the pro-rector of the vice-rector of the University of Oslo, who was part of the ceremony. And there's a small memorial chapel that has been built just where these skulls were buried. So this is about 1 hour by car from my home village. So one of the things I'm sort of grappling with at the moment and trying to write about is, well, thinking about, can we describe what happened in Northern Norway as a form of colonialization? So even though this area was not colonized in the same manner as non-European regions, there are some striking similarities in views on knowledge production, oppressive policies, and devaluation of local cultural practices. Ngugi Othongo writes about colonization of the mind or mental control, and Santos, the destruction of knowledge through colonial domination. And for me, I found that these were tools I could use for trying to understand more of what happened in Northern Norway. So I think what it shows, and when I say violence in this context, I don't mean physical violence primarily. I'm talking about mental or spiritual violence. So violence of racism was not only present in colonialism in the geographical south. So I would suggest that in Norway, the formation of the nation state was carried out in tandem with processes of colonialization. There were absences and erasures of local cultural practices and ways of understanding and describing and seeing the world. They were erased, which led to widespread language shift. So, but there are other types of silencing. So you have the law that could limit the use of a language. You would have teachers who in some cases would ban their pupils from speaking it. You might have problems buying land if you don't speak, if you didn't speak Norwegian. But there was, of course, because the language shift, also silencing within our community. The cultural historian Connaughton has described in his article 7 types of forgetting. One of the types he describes is forgetting as humiliated silence. And I've written about how this mental control or the change in the way people are thinking and the way they see themselves, the consequences of these Norwegian assimilatory policies, they can become internalized to such an extent that people stop questioning hegemonic discourses or of the inferiority of other languages than Norwegian, to the extent that they just take this for granted or took it for granted and didn't ask any question, and in many cases didn't even notice or reflect on that they only spoke Norwegian to their children. I just leave the references there for a second. So I quote Connaughton. So this is forgetting is humiliated silence. Perhaps it is paradoxical to speak of such a condition as evidence for a form of forgetting, because occasions of humiliation are so difficult to forget. It is often easier to forget physical pain than to forget humiliation. Yet few things are more eloquent than a massive silence. And in the collusive silence brought on by a particular kind of collective shame, there is detectable both a desire to forget and sometimes the actual effect of forgetting. So I find this particularly what he wrote, that there are few things that are more eloquent than a massive silence. The silence in my home community when it came to language and culture, when we grew up, it encompassed everything. I didn't even know that I had grown up in a multilingual village until I went to university and shared a flat with a friend who studied anthropology, because the other languages were not languages. They were not recognized, never mentioned, even though they were the languages the adults spoke. So there are some interesting parallels in what Ngugi wa Thiong'o writes about change and control of people's culture and self-definition, or the way we see ourselves. That is the way to dominate or control people. Its most important area of domination was the mental universe of the colonized, the control through culture, or how people perceive themselves and their relationship to the world. Economic and political control can never be complete or effective without mental control. To control a people's culture is to control their tools of self-definition in relationship to others. These these processes of language shift have often been described in terms of language ideologies. And let's see, a couple of definitions. Language ideologies are conceptualization about languages, speakers, and discursive practices. Like other kinds of ideologies, language ideologies are pervaded with political and moral interests and are shaped in a cultural setting. So study language ideologies then is to explore the nexus of language, culture, and politics. It is to examine how people construe language's role in a social and cultural world and how their construals are socially positioned. These construals include the ways people conceive of language itself, as well as what they understand by the particular languages and ways of speaking that are within their purview. Language ideologies are inherently plural because they are positioned. There is always another position, another perspective from which the world of discursive practice is differently viewed. I don't in any way disagree neither with this definition of language ideology or that these are very useful. It's a very useful concept for trying to explore what happens in processes of language shift and then later in revitalization. But I also came to think that there are some things that this approach didn't explain sufficiently for me. So that's when I started to turn more to complement these perspectives by perspectives from indigenous scholarships and Southern perspectives. I am interested in how ideologies shape the way we think, because somebody forms them or controls them. So what happens in our minds? And then by that I mean our personal and cultural mind. So if we return, go to some of my data, this is another person who was interviewed in 1975. She's in my grandparents' generation. So the teacher asked her about how it was when she started school. So she said she only first talks about her own experience when she started school, and then she talks about her daughter. And she says, "Se ollut hyvä, että suomi on Norjan koulu oli. Niin, että kun sehän oppi vasta sitten, kun oli niin iso työ, niin että." So it took such a long time for her children to learn Norwegian. So she saw that as a problem for them. Another lady of the same generation, she was asked by the interviewer if she spoke Finnish to her children. And she said her daughter, when she was smaller, she cried when I spoke Finnish. And she said that she won't answer because you can't talk properly. She cried many times. And she asked her daughter if she'd noticed that I had some problems translating that word that you can see disturbed, bothered, because hiasta can mean both. But did you ever get disturbed or bothered or ashamed? It's difficult to translate. When mommy and daddy speak Finnish, she said, yes, it's like this for everybody. In Kven or Finnish, they say se lyöbi läpi. Lyöbi actually means it's not trickle, it means that it hits through, but if I were to translate it literally, but that's not idiomatic English. But this is an attitude that was very common when I grew up. The Kven or Sami, for that matter, they were not good languages. They would seep through, they would strike through and ruin our Norwegian. They said many times they are so angry. Many times there have been that this Finnish language can just disappear because we can't even learn proper Norwegian. So these were the attitudes in 1975. Another interesting aspect is that the people who we interviewed, they were also asked, what do you think will be the future of the Finnish spoken here in Buganes? And what's interesting here is that Christina, she says that she doesn't even know how she learned Finnish. So there's this attitude which we also see in other studies of language shift, for instance, Don Kulik's study on Papua New Guinea, that people are blind to the language shift that are happening, so they don't notice the ongoing language shift. So I have permission from Christina to play this, and also the clip with my mother. So I'll play this for you so you can just get to hear what.
No, näyttääkö se siltä, että tämä suomen kieli katoaa pois?
Do you think Finnish will disappear?
Häviää.
En tiedä. En minä tiedä sanoa siihen mitään. Minusta tuntuu, että kaikki ne pratavat suomia. Niin, kun ne vähän täytyvät, niin ne alkaa pratamaan suomia. Mutta sehän saattaa, että se katoaa pois. Niin, på längenetivet. Mutta en minä tiedä. Niin kuin ne on oppinut suomia. En tiedä, mistä minä olen oppinut. Se on tullut kuin. Niin.
So she says she doesn't even know where she learned, it has just come. I interviewed Christina with her daughter in 2004. And then she said, this interview was conducted in Norwegian. And then she said, before we said, Mom and Dad said, you can't speak Norwegian, nor can you speak Finnish. You don't know anything properly, linguistically putrid. After I had published this, I noticed that she said "third," which can be translated as before or earlier, might be a better translation. So Christina positions this statement in the past, so implicitly saying that things are different now. So in the same interview, she talks about that it was ignorance, that they only spoke Norwegian to their children, and a decision that she regrets. So here are some of the language ideologies that were present. When the HL there refers to heritage language, so that would be Kven in this context. But the key dominant ideology is the monolingual nation state. In Norway, we speak Norwegian and Norwegian only. So it made it difficult to start school. It took a long time for the pupils to understand. If they spoke Norwegian, it was easier. And the Kven or Finnish would ruin the children's Norwegian. They also compare their Kven to Finnish spoken in Finland. So they would say that our Finnish is broken Finnish or Paskasuomi, which actually means shit Finnish. I had some problems writing that on the slide. So they measure their Norwegian up against a Norwegian perceived way of speaking and experience that it fell short. And they measure their Kven up against Finnish spoken in Finland. So they had like a dual inferiority complex. Fortunately, things are different now, in case I forget to say this later. There's been a reclamation of local identity and belonging in the North. But there was still pain and vulnerabilities. So one of the key questions that I keep battling with and trying to answer, why after the oppressive policies have been abandoned? So the last law that was abolished was 1964. The language shift happened after this. And the pain and vulnerabilities of the past still lingered. So in order to analyze this, I don't have time to go into a very detailed analysis here, but I have drawn on a concept from Nexus analysis developed by Ron and Susie Skoll, historical body, which is a concept that comes from the Japanese philosopher Nishida. It has some similarities to Bourdieu's notion of habitus, but it is, as they write, it situates bodily memories more precisely in the individual body. So a lifetime of personal habits come to feel so natural that one's body carries out action seemingly without being told. So I use this concept to analyze language shift by saying that the negative consequences of the Norwegianization policies were internalized by some and Kven people. So in my grandparents' and parents' generation. And then this was internalized in their historical bodies and in turn passed on to my generation through social practice. Santos also draws our attention to the body. So he writes, I think that the epistemologies of the South have focused on the body because the struggles are carried out by fighting bodies, and the body suffers, rejoices, and dies. So another aspect of silencing is that minority or minoritized speakers sometimes also silence ourselves. And this has both an inner and an outer dimension. So I explore this more fully in a book that's due to, or in my chapter in a book that's due to be published by Cambridge University Press. It's called Multilingualism in History, and it's edited by Annette Pavlenko, Alexander Duchesne, and myself. So the outer dimension of silencing is a fear, real or perceived, of being judged by more proficient speakers. I started speaking Kven as an adult, and I wasn't at all prepared for the inner struggle or the inner battle that I had to face, or the barrier I had to overcome in order to dare to speak. So a part of that was that I felt that I didn't speak properly enough. I was afraid to be corrected or judged by others. Another thing such speakers who reclaim a language also face is that they worried, will we be perceived as legitimate and authentic speakers? So some of those who learn Kven and Sami in the educational system, they learn via a written standard. So they can speak quite grammatically correct and have good vocabulary, but as we've also seen in other minority and indigenous contexts, they may be told that they talk like a book. So we have researchers like Bernie O'Rourke, who's written about this from Galician, and John Walsh from about Irish. This fear of being judged can also lead speakers to perpetuate non-linguistic practices. So we might shy away from the situations where we are expected to converse or talk freely and be part of religious performances, singing, or where, like I'm wearing now, I'm wearing Sami earrings because that is a way to have a part of Saminess without embarking on using the language. So this is a Sami person who was interviewed by Sini Rasmus, my and main author of this article. He said, if I was going to talk, then I had to talk perfectly and properly. I thought that I could not say something wrong. If I did that, the barriers came out. I thought that everyone expected that I should speak perfectly. I think that became an extra barrier. What is interesting, I haven't managed to actually find this Sami or Kven word for this. It can mean barrier or block. So people would use the word in Norwegian even when they speak Sami or Kven. Silencing also has an inner dimension. So the other thing that took me by surprise when I started speaking Kven was that I experienced almost like a sense of an existential vulnerability. There was like an inner pain. And it's very difficult to explain, and I guess even harder to analyze, though I am working on some autobiographical interviews with people who have started to speak Sami as adults. But one of the potential, I don't know if I would call it an explanation, but a way of trying to come to terms with this, I started thinking that, yeah, speakers may face a sense of loss resulting from oppression and stigmatization experienced by themselves or their parents. So this is part of our historical bodies. So it's been eternalized, and we might not always even be aware that this is what we carry with us. We may be confronted with a burden, shame, and devaluation of the past. So indigenous minorities are often associated with like a positive belonging to place and family, but we also carry a history of alienation, humiliation, and shame. Another thing is that I wondered about when I learned Kven. Why was it so much harder than learning English or French? And I have interviews with people who express the same thing, that they find it really easy to speak English and they don't really worry if they make a mistake. But speaking Kven or Sami, that is hard. And I think if part of this is that we are expected to reclaim what we already have or ought to possess. So this history that we carry with us can be empowering and give us a sense of identity and belonging, but paradoxically, it can also have the opposite effect, that we are expected to know this language. So there's a sense of failure if we don't. King and Hermes write about some of the similar things in the context of Ojibwe in the US, and they call it the scars of colonialization. So one of the things I am exploring now is that I look at how this painful experience or history can cause us to silence ourselves because we shy away from speaking. So this is from a blog, and I have some problems reading the beginning because my screen share bar is on top of it. This is from a blog by a Sami blogger whose name is Sira Gaski. Gaski actually is a family name in my family on my grandfather's side as well. She has a very interesting blog where she writes about a lot of things, but this one is entitled "Who is Afraid of Sami Language?" So he said, she writes that basically she's afraid of speaking Sami, but she realizes that she has to speak, that I have to act with and communicate with Sami, at least until proven otherwise, that I have to introduce bures, which means good day, as my default greeting, with a hope that this will make Sami-speaking people crawl out of the Norwegian-speaking woodworks we're stuck in, that I have to stop fearing gollegela until I get so comfortable with it that I forget that it is what I speak when I use it. But it is scary. It is really scary, and I don't know if I dare. But my Sami pain, the real, genuine pain, not the ironic Sami pain, is, as for so many others, the language. But anyway, I don't want to be afraid of my language. I want to use it without fear and jump into it so often that I no longer get affected by potential language police bruises, even if this will take time and perhaps never go away. But sometimes one has to stop being afraid. Now I will try. At least I will think about it. In the article co-authored with Sini Rasmus, Sini did all the interviews. So she talked with a man who told her about when he started talking. So I started talking after I got my first child. Only when I was alone with her. When my wife was pregnant, we only spoke Norwegian. It was really hard in the beginning. When we were alone, I whispered in Sami so that I got used to the sounds and words. I started like that. It was really hard. It helped a lot to whisper alone with a child. It took about 1 year before I was able to speak Sami when my wife was with us. So I thought that was such a moving story. And this is a point in a lot of young Sami people's lives in Norway at the moment, that they make a decision to speak Sami when they get their first child. And of course, they actually do speak Sami well, because they've learned it through the educational system for many, many years. But this is this transition from having a language that you've learned in school to actually starting to speak it. This article that I think you've got the link to it, there's also, Cindy and I, we discussed some of the ways speakers create safe spaces. So there are ways of solving this dilemma that speakers face when they reclaim a language. So finally, I wanted to let you hear some Sami as well. So I didn't want to end the presentation with all what is difficult and all these silences, because people actually do get out of silence as well. And a case in point that I wanted to share with you, this is a yoik. A yoik is a traditional Sami way of singing that was silenced and even forbidden in some contexts during the Norwegianization period. But in the Battle of the Stars, which is a Norwegian talent show run by the Norwegian Broadcasting Company, they included yoik as a genre in 2017. So from being marginalized and hidden, it was brought into like the common Norwegian scene. And all the participants would do a yoik, and they would get guidance by a professional yoiker. The thing is that when you yoik, you don't only yoik about something, you also yoik something or someone. So Ella Maria yoiks the village Mase that was supposed to be submerged underwater when Norway built a large hydroelectric plant. And as an aside, this construction and the whole debate about the construction of the power plant, that actually sparked the Sami revitalization movement in Norway. But this is a battle song. And there are some words in Sami which are beautiful, Mase, dear Mase, and water they would make cover, Mase church, Mase school. This is my translation. I got Cindy to check that I had translated it correctly, because I'm not a very good speaker of Sami. The water was supposed to go to the top of the church spire. So the village was spared, the power plant was built, and there were a lot of other rights that the Sami people got that I don't have time to get into, I won't get into details about now. But I just want to, I will end my presentation after the conclusion with just playing this yoik for you. So Ella Maria, she's from my neighboring municipality. She grew up with Sami, but she experienced racism when she moved to a larger town. And the way she yoiks Mase, it's not only a yoik about Mase, the village, and the battle for Sami rights in the late 70s, early 80s. It is a yoik about silence, struggle, pain, resistance, but also victory. So to remind us about what Santos said, that the epistemologies of the South have focused on the body, because the struggles are carried out by fighting bodies, and the body suffers, rejoices, and dies. And I think this yoik is a beautiful example of the fighting body and victory, and that we actually can overcome oppression. So in a book Ella Maria wrote, she said, it felt as if so far an unknown force had inhabited my body. I could feel that Adja, Isak, and Ahko, Sara, Ellen, Maria, my grandparents, stood behind me on the stage and lifted me up. I felt the safety in the hands from all of them. They yoiked with me. This was the night that changed everything. This was like confronting all the pain and all anger our ancestors have carried. This is also a reminder, in a sense, that this is also spiritual experience, I think this type of fighting transcends politics and battles. And spirituality can be seen as inhabiting a broader space than religion that includes a sense of significance and emotional attachment to an object outside ourselves. So some quick concluding thoughts. I was even tempted to not call it concluding thoughts. I was tempted to say that these are more like unfinished and further thoughts. So the decolonialization of the mind, which I think is what Ella Maria does in this yoik, and perhaps that I, at least for myself, do through my research now, is a painful but also liberating experience. These additional ecologies or knowledges can help us see the world anew. We can see other possible futures that we can imagine that are born out of struggle and awareness of suffering, which also means that facing hurts from the past is not in vain. So as our historical body carry the past, our body can also reclaim and help us create new, imagine and create new possible futures. And finally, out of silence, whose voices are heard? There is a silence in the academia as well. There is an epistemology of absences. So some voices are heard and get given more room than others. So I think it's also something that Southern perspective and Indigenous perspectives can help us see. They can help us overcome silencing in the academia, and also remind us that research in itself can be a transformative and healing experience. So I will end with playing Ella Maria's yoik for you. Thank you for your patience, and thank you for the invitation to be a part of your forum.
Thank you so much, Pia. I absolutely love the yoga. I had like goosebumps. Oh my God. Dr. Marconi, over to you with the first question for our guest speaker.
Yes. Thank you very much for this fascinating presentation. But what I'm going to try and do is a bit unfair, but I think it might be useful. I'm just going to read the first two paragraphs to a foreword that was written by Lynn Mario. And then perhaps Lynn Mario may comment more on it so that we begin to have a multi-party conversation from the very beginning. This is a foreword to a book that Basi Antia and myself have just edited called Southernizing Sociolinguistics. And in the foreword, Lynn Mario, who is here in the forum, writes, "It has recently become almost a commonplace to speak of a sociolinguistics of the South, as if this simply involves a shift of focus of analysis from a previous focus on the global to a newer one on the local. It has also become a commonplace from the perspective of decolonial and Southern theories to critique what appears to be the global as either the colonial universalization and globalized imposition of its Eurocentric local, or as a manifestation of European exceptionalism. All these apparent changes of focus from the global to the local could seem to involve little more than a refreshing change of perspective. However, as the chapters in this book show, things are much more complex than what they may seem. At issue is not a simple change of the what of language analysis from one location to another. Also, and perhaps more important, is the how that produces different whats in different locations. This assumes that rather than a mere change of perspective and a resulting plethora of alternative perspectives, what is significant is the move to the local, is the importance given to the questioning of what was previously understood as linguistics in the singular, and sociolinguistics as the application of this singular in varied local contexts. Encouragingly, what is being questioned in recent decolonial and Southern theories of language is the previously naturalized singularity of linguistic knowledge. Now, let me give over to Lynn Mario to expand, and then you can pass the question over to Pia. Lynn, the floor is yours. A bit unfair, but that's the danger of writing. People just quote your work without telling you.
I think you're still muted, Limario.
I was just saying how Sintri was throwing me to the lions. But there were two questions that I was going to ask Pia. By the way, hi, Pia. Which are curiously, or perhaps not so curiously, related to what Sintri just raised. First, the significance of the move to looking at bodies, which Pia, you raise in various ways, starting off with the Skolans showing the limitation of Bourdieu's notion of the habitus, right, and calling attention to the body, the memory of the body, and secondly, related to this is when you raise the issue of language ideologies as well. Here I'm taking into account obviously my own research and my own multilingual experiences. First, let me begin with the habitus versus the body dimension, because issue rather. Habitus, Bourdieu's notion of the habitus, this is one of the things that is making things complicated for us in Southernizing, in sociolinguistic gesture. because we're still very much connected to our origins, our Marxist origins, and their focus on social class, or rather their focus on groups which are presupposed as homogeneous, right? And so one of my critiques, and this is through reading Rancière's criticism of Bourdieu, one of the critiques of Habitus is that it globalizes a social class, it homogenizes a whole social class, right? Without questioning from whose perspective. So where Bourdieu is talking about, for example, the working classes in France in relation to the bourgeoisie, right? Even when he talks about taste, for example, in terms of aesthetic taste, he's generalizing, as Rancière tries to show, he's generalizing as if workers are not allowed to have tastes which are similar to bourgeois tastes. Just an example of what happens when we look at things top down. So when we choose a group or a social class, we're looking top down. And this is a methodology that we've inherited from our, let's say, left-centered humanities perspectives, right? Our traditions, at least in my generation. Now, when we look at it from bodies, we're looking at it as bottom up. We're looking at bodies. Firstly, bodies are always situated, but they are not, their situation cannot be generalized, because bodies may have different histories, even though they are in, let's say, the same space. For example, your own experience, you were in the same space as your families, but your history of language, your experience of language and your pain is different from the generation of your parents, for example, right? Now that would be difficult to explain if we used habitus as our category of analysis. But it's not difficult to explain when we use body, because we can see bodies may be located in the same space, but they don't have identical histories. Their histories may overlap, but they are not necessarily identical. So bodies allow us to look at, to analyze social phenomena without falling into homogenization, which comes when we look at them top down and look at them as groups, right? Now, and that would make clear, for example, the body brings in the element of pain, right? And the element of pain can vary from one social history to another. I see it in my own family, amongst my brothers who had a similar background to me, but had different individual histories, right? Their pain in terms of language loss or language shift varies from one, our pain varies from one to another, right? Now, the second aspect related to this, in terms of language ideologies, which you very importantly mentioned, I think it's important when we're looking at multilingualism to recuperate how language ideologies affect how we look at multilingualism. And here I'm going back to the work of the Indian sociolinguist Lakshman Khubchandani. So he says that if we begin to look at language from the perspective of monolinguals, we'll end up in a different place than if we look at language from the perspective of multilinguals. Especially from multilingualism in Africa and Asia, for example, where multilingualism is bodily and not group. So multilingualism doesn't consist of different monolingual groups occupying the same space. It consists of multilingual bodies transiting between different groups. You see, the difference that this makes is that it will tell us that we shouldn't look at multilingualism from a monolingual perspective. We should look at it from a bodily perspective, meaning a more situated perspective, right? So rather than looking at multilingualism from this monolingual perspective, which will bring us back to named languages, defined languages, bordered languages, right? If we look at it from a bodily perspective, multilingual users never have a complete notion of of a language. They don't have this bordered notion of language, right? So they'll have a notion of perhaps language resources, repertoires, but not a notion of language as bordered, homogeneous, standardized, defined, objectified. Right? So I think it's important to see how we are influenced by our monolingual ideologies, even when we are looking at multilingualism. So multilingualism is not a collection of monolinguals. We have to look at multilingualism through situated bodies. That will bring a different dimension. And I think that, Pia, this helps you a lot in, this is what you are doing in practice, right? When you're talking about pain and memory, right? You're looking at multilingualism from a bodily perspective and not from a group perspective. But at some moments, it's not clear, right? If you're speaking of bordered languages, defined languages or not. You at least it wasn't clear to me. You spoke of Kven as being different from Finnish, but being mutually comprehensible, right? And then the official recognition of Kven. So Kven may be just, and I like the word. What's the word? Language as bundle, right? Kven may be a bundle of dialects. I'm just using dialect for lack of a better word. So then Kven may be a collective term for a bundle of different linguistic phenomena, obviously situated, right? Not just random. But then when it's called Kven, you fall back into the trap of the nation, which defines Kven or recognizes Kven as a language, right? So how do we navigate these issues, right? Pia, that's my, these are my questions.
I think that, thank you, Lynn Mario. I think that, or if I broke down what you said into little pieces, I think each section could be a new talk. But I think I will pick up on body and language. So I think you are very right what you point out with the body. And this is something that I've been like circling in different ways through my work for at least the past 15 years. So I worked with concepts like historical body and social actor and users and individuals. And I think each term can help me analyze in a different way. But my interest lies in how do people experience their languages, or what you would call bundles of features, perhaps. So I think that type of the focus on body and experiences, and we also see this shift in, for instance, in research on second language acquisition and in a lot of social linguistic approaches. It allows us to ask different questions and perhaps get different knowledges that can complement the larger picture, which I think is important, because we can analyze ideologies and language policy, but if I don't see what it could do on the ground, then they become very abstract. Also, what I realized, what I have been doing was that even though I've done research, and I am not the only one doing this, so I could say we, even those of us who do research in these multilingual environments, often what we do is that we pick out one language. So I've done that through most of my career. I have written only about Kven, whereas the area, my home municipality has two different Sami languages. There were very close ties to Russia. There used to be a Russian Norwegian pidgin language. My grandmother was sent to fostering in what today is Russia. So all those things, we ignored them. So we picked out like one language and focused on the people who spoke that language. So this is also what I'm trying to do now, to move more into taking the body as a starting point, and then I can see their linguistic or language environment in relation to their experiences. And I think that allows for a more multilingual perspective. The other thing, of course, about language, that is a whole other issue. And I think that could be like at least a 1-hour lecture. I think all standard languages are constructs. All languages are collections of dialects and individual features. For me, who've grown up in a situation where Norwegian and Kven obviously are very different if you analyze them linguistically, I wouldn't say that language doesn't exist, but I think we've got to look more at where does it originate from. So I think language is a cultural practice. So language arises through use. And repeated patterns then get established and internalized, and then we get grammar. So I do believe that grammar and linguistic structures are internalized, but I don't think we are born with them. I think they arise and get passed on through use. And therefore some structures are maintained and some disappear. And with that view of language, it's not a problem to explain what we used to call code switching, for instance. Because you can see language in that way without seeing them as monolithic entities. So I think that would be the short boiled down answer to that. But of course, it's very difficult when you give a lecture, or I'm stuck each time I'm going to write about Kven, because, so I have this sort of standardized formulation because people always wonder how different is it from Finnish. And to me, that's not the important question, but I understand why people ask that question.
Okay.
But that was an attempt at a short answer.
Thank you, Pia.
Thank you, Mario.
Yeah, thank you very much. Let me pose another question, then I'll give over to Magda and Raphael and open up the discussion. If you're going to talk about bodies or bodily perspectives towards language, then the next step is you then have to explore what is the role of food in how does food shape your ontological views about language? Because bodies, yes, suffer pain, but bodies have to eat food in order to survive. So my question to you is, what is the role and status ontologically of food in shaping your understanding of sociolinguistics?
If that was a question I did not expect. Do you mean food in a more like a metaphor, or in a physical bodily sense?
Whatever direction you want to take the question.
Of course, my mind went in both directions at the same time.
You just choose one. I'm saying that food, taste, and all that once you talk about bodies, one of the issues that comes up is the notion of food. We have to eat food.
Yeah. I think the more metaphorical aspect is also to look at what nourishes us. I just got an idea for an article, Sinfri. Thank you.
Okay, thank you
because, I feel like I've been writing and thinking a lot about silence, and now the next step is overcoming silence.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's also a matter of what we digest, because our bodies are not separate from the world. So how we nourish ourselves and each other, of course, that has an impact on on the type of futures we get.
Okay.
But of course, the physical aspect of food is also an interesting issue, because we have like food traditions that are being revived. That would be linked to more like refinding or revival or carrying on with cultural practices.
Okay, I better stop with about 17 different comments in the chat box. Raphael.
Thanks, Makoni and Limario, for initiating the discussion, and thanks, Pia, for the very interesting presentation. And thanks everyone for your thoughts and comments and questions in the chat. I see that Shayla shared an article in which she talked about the linguistic realities of Bangladesh. And also there are some comments from Susan about language portrait being an excellent method to get into the bodily dimension of multilingualism. And I'm going to remind you then that if you'd like to ask a question or a comment, please feel free to raise your virtual hand, as Sally Kokumofene just did, or write it in the chat. I'm going to start then with a question written in the chat by Maya, and then I will move on to pass the digital floor to Sally Koku. So, Maya, would you like to ask the question yourself, or do you want me to read it for you?
Yes, I can ask. Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Dr. Lin, thank you so much for a wonderful talk. I've noticed in your portrayals of the Kven parents that they were bilingual, in fact, because they were able to speak Norwegian to their children. So having experienced firsthand that it's possible to be bilingual, why did they favor speaking only in Norwegian to their children versus taking another approach?
Yeah, that is, thank you, a difficult and important question. I think they, I think they had internalized this idea that Norwegian was the only useful language, that was what was needed, and the other stuff we spoke, they weren't acknowledged. So, excuse me, I just got a cough. Sort of feels wrong to cough because of COVID, even when you are on the screen. Yeah, but it is quite interesting why they didn't see that we could be bilingual. Of course, this is what a lot of people say now. You imagine we could have been bilingual or multilingual, we could have spoken all those languages. But often what they said was, we did what we thought was best for you. So they internalized this idea that Norwegian was the only proper language, the only language of progress, modernity, the only language that could get us anywhere, even though most of them thought that their children would stay in the village and continue as fishermen or working in the fish or meat processing factory. Because there weren't that many who left. My generation were the first one who left the village. So I'm actually first with more than my generation with more than 7 years of schooling. I find what is more puzzling is that our grandparents' generation spoke Norwegian only to us. And I remember when I look back at it in retrospect that a lot of them obviously were limited. So they were so eloquent and funny and alive and resourceful in Kven or Sami, but in Norwegian they were hindered, and still they spoke this language with their grandchildren only. So I was privileged because I understood Kven. So I could see that other side of them, or almost like this other world in a way. Yeah. So I don't think there is a very clear answer to that question. Part of that, of course, is linked to that in the, and we still have a monolingual ideology that prevails in society today. So it's not uncommon that my grandparents in Norway get told by politicians that they should speak Norwegian only to their children. So I wonder how come the politicians have learned so little from the mistakes we made in the past. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Maya and Pia, and Salikoko.
Yes, and thank you, Pia, for a brilliant presentation, very informative one. I'll make just a few comments, starting with Sinfried's question about food and your reaction to it. 3 days ago, I received an invitation to give a plenary on decolonizing linguistics, and they asked me to propose some titles. And one of the titles I proposed was what kind of linguistics would we be doing if linguistics had been developed in the global south and by people in the global south? And another title was How Food and Sex Delayed the Emergence of Pigeons. And I thought that the second one was the one that nobody would consider, and that's the one that they prefer, because it conjured up the lifestyles of Europeans during the trade colonization of Africa and Asia, and where they stayed, what part they played, and whose help they got. And it turns out that women played an important role in connecting European traders to the interior. And women formed unions with these Europeans. And they just told me, and they had children, and the children became bilingual in an indigenous language or several indigenous languages, and the representatives of the European mercantile companies. And this is the story I've been developing over the past decade or so. And these children became major players in the trade colonization. They acted as brokers, as interpreters, which becomes critical when you explain that the trade was not just any European coming to Africa in a boat to trade with any African. It was fleets sent by mercantile companies with employees of the companies trading not with everybody, anybody in Africa, because a lot of people prefer not to interact with Europeans, but with African rulers and things like that. So that really helped. The other thing that struck me is how you, part of the answer that you gave to Lynn Mario with these comments, and especially in highlighting the fact that languages are consequences of communication, communicative practices. It's not languages first and communication, it's communication first and languages. And it actually becomes easier to explain language endangerment and loss when you present things that way, rather than when you present things in terms of knowledge of languages and losing knowledge of those languages, the languages that are concerned and so forth. And something that I found brilliant in your presentation is that you didn't focus on the small size of the relevant populations. You put a lot of, you really clarified what I characterize population structure of Norway, how the Sami in particular fit in, and how land was taken from the Sami, how the Norwegians make sure that by populating the areas with where the Sami live with Norwegian, developing businesses in Norwegian and speaking Norwegian and forcing people to evolve in Norwegian, that is really makes a difference. And this is something that I have tried to highlight in my work, against people that think that the colonization of the world has advantaged European languages, and the European languages are replacing indigenous languages all over the world. But in reality, when you pay attention, the population structures in which Europeans have inserted themselves outside Europe have not been identical, say, from the New World, the Americas and Australia to Africa and Asia. And this is something that I think Lynn Mario also made clear in his comments. And this can also explain very well, and you did it, the difference between just silencing people, which does not necessarily mean that people give up those languages because you silence them, because they might find ways of keeping some sort of practice in those languages. And so the woman that said, well, I don't know how I learned to speak it. I just speak it. It came to me. Well, it reminds me of something that is happening now in Martinique, where parents are not speaking to their children in Martinique, the Creole. But they talk to each other in Creole in front of their children. The parents talk to each other in Creole. And then when children become teenagers, guess what? They play in Creole, but they didn't practice it in the family. And when the Martiniquais go to France and they realize that they are treated as second-ranked citizens, French citizens in France, that's where they become even more involved with Creole. And they activate something that was kind of passive. These are the people that speak Creole with vengeance when they come back to Martinique, because it gives them this kind of identity. So there is so much that is so complex in the dynamics of the encounters between Europeans and non-Europeans, especially outside Europe, that now I realize, well, even in Europe, you can probably observe some of the same dynamics. And so I wound up with a little bit of confusion that I'm going to turn into a question now. What do I have to think after listening to you? Is Sami likely to be revitalized through your reclamation? The reclamation of the Sami people that are in a context where they can develop pride in the background and overcome the humiliation of being associated with a language that is relatively backward. Or shall I say, should I think, well, there is no hope because Norwegian remains the dominant language in Norway and Sami is going to die? Thank you, otherwise.
Thank you for your very insightful and thought and stimulating comments. I think it's also a reminder that it's important to look more into sort of comparative perspectives, both with indigenous communities in other parts of the world, but also migrant communities in Europe. So, but to your question about Sami, Norway has, I sort of feel that I can't count languages now, but three Sami languages. Lula and South Sami are very small. They only have a few hundred speakers. North Sami is a fairly vital language, particularly in the inland area. So if you live in the inland area in the north, for instance, the village that was going to be submerged by the water power plant, there in that area, Sami is the most used language for everyday communication. So I think it would be perhaps even difficult to live there without speaking Sami. So there are certain municipalities in Norway where children can get their entire schooling in Sami. So, but what I'm interested in is the situation for the Sami languages or Sami along the coast, because the language shift happened earlier there and revitalization happened later. And this population and the Kven, we are all intermarried. So there are many families that have been trilingual, or like my family, and along the coast, the North Sami language is far more vulnerable. But Norway has granted a lot of rights to the to Sami speakers, and particularly for North Sami, they seem to have had quite an effect. So they managed to turn the tide. So I'm quite confident that at least we will hear people who speak North Sami in 50 years. And there are more children growing up speaking Sami now.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I've seen that we are already 10 minutes over our official 90-minute session, but if Pia agrees, I would like to squeeze in 2 more interventions, one by Oyedonke, who's raised her hand, and then one that I will ask on behalf of Sangeeta. She wrote it in the chat that she has a problem with her mic. Is that okay, Pia? Yeah, thank you. Oyedonke.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Anyway, I'm in New York City, so it's good morning here. Thank you so much, Pierre, for that wonderful, wonderful presentation. And of course, I'm listening to it as an African. And the way in which Africans always want to take cues from Europe and say that, well, why can't we also have just one lingua franca like the Europeans? But today you totally exposed the Norwegians, right? And all that one language, monolingual, is constructed. But quickly, the question that I want to raise here, what came to my mind is that more recently, I was looking at African naming systems and epistemologies and the impact of colonization on African names, and the myriad and multilingual names that one person carries. And then it dawned on me that naming is clearly very much part of the so-called language question. And then as I listened to the yoika, can I say that?
You can say that, yeah.
As I listened to the yoika, it seemed as if at some point she mentions the names of her grandparents. And then it seemed as if there was another set of names. I'm not sure whether she had mentioned some Sami names and they had other types of names. So what that brings to my mind is this question: what role did names play in the imposition of Norwegian in your community? And indeed, what is the role of naming in the creation of these identities and a sense of self? And how might we use naming as a way of liberating people who had been imposed upon? Thank you.
Thank you. That is an excellent question. I had a slide on names that I took out because I realized my talk would be too long. So yeah, naming is important. The names of the Kven and Sami populations were Norwegianized. So for instance, my maiden name was Bauna, which actually is, I realized as an adult, it is actually a Finnish family name from northern Finland. I always thought it was Finnish, but it was changed according to Norwegian spelling rules. It was pronounced, written with a B instead of a P, and it was pronounced Bauna instead of Bauna. And that never felt like my name. So, which made things easier when I'm married. It's actually my husband, my last name is my husband's name. He is South African, because I felt that I didn't have a name to give up because that name had been taken from me already. Now one is allowed to write these names, such names according to Kven and Sami orthography. So it's become more common that people take back their names. So one of my daughters took back this as she added Bauna as her middle name. My cousin, whose family name is Persson, and that was a constructed name, Per and son, so the son of Per. So a lot of Kven and Sami people would have those names because the priest would give them that name and they were baptized, or perhaps they hoped they could buy land. So my cousin took back her old Sami family name that also comes from northern Finland. And particularly in Sami, also in Kven communities, there was a tradition of naming children after ancestors. So if in some Sami communities, if you had a great aunt who were associated with something that had a nice personality, you could give your child the name of that great aunt in the hope that the child would embody some of that person's abilities. And there was also, I think this is the case in many rural communities, but it seems to have been more common amongst Kven and Sami than in southern rural communities. It's quite common to have additional names that would be used to describe how you belong, or a feature of your parents, or a particular personality trait. So if you have somebody working in the post office, he could be Posti Petri. So Petri would be his name and Posti would be post. I was often called Baunan Dutte because I was very close to my grandfather. So that means the girl of Bauna. So, but those things, they carried on, but they were like under the radar of Norwegian authorities. But a lot of Kven and Sami family names were lost, and people are now taking them back.
Thank you. And then the last one I will read what Sangeeta wrote in the chat. Thanks, Pia. Unfortunately, I don't have a functioning mic, so I'm posting a question. Could you comment the issue of privilege in terms of the recognition and revitalization of Sami named languages, social practices, etc. in this decade, in particular, compared to the continuing marginalizations of immigrants, but also other recognized minorities in Scandinavian spaces? I'm thinking of the striking similarities between the Kven case you illustrate, the Sami cases I am aware of in Sweden on the one hand, and deaf populations in both Sweden and Norway, large and smaller immigrants across the 20th century into Swedish spaces on the other hand. Could the contemporary focus on Kven, Sami, etc. be understood in terms of privilege?
That is a very interesting and also difficult question to answer. I think, as I mentioned earlier, I think one of the most striking things with Norwegian language policy is that they haven't always learned from the mistakes they made with the Kven and Sami people in the past. Norway has just passed a new language law that incorporates Sami and the national minority languages, the Kven and Romani and Romanes, and also sign language. So sign language users in Norway, they do have rights, but I don't know, you can have equal rights on paper, but also what counts is if funding doesn't follow your rights, you don't always get the chance to develop your language as you would like. So I think particularly for the deaf community in Norway, they often get forgotten. So news broadcasters might forget to get interpreters. Parents who get a deaf child might not always get the best advice as to how they should support their child's language development. Or children of deaf adults, they might not always get the support needed to learn sign language. So I think when you look at, there are always language hierarchies when you bring rights into the perspective. So if you are children who grow up in this particular Sami language administrative district, they actually have a legal right to get their education in Sami. And a Sami child, no matter where they live in Norway, they have the right to get teaching of Sami. Because the Samis are recognized as an indigenous group of people. So, so I think it is quite fair to say that we have a hierarchy of privilege in Norway, and something that we also should address. So thank you for your questions, Sangeeta. Because I'm looking at you, but you can't see that. So I should look into the camera and say thank you.
Thank you, Pia. And thanks everyone for your comments and questions. So we now hand it over to Makoni to finish up the session.
Okay, Pia, thank you very much. I think your presentation raised a number of very important points. The first one, I think, is the need to adopt to some extent a critical evaluation of what we think might be the merits of Southern approaches to sociolinguistics. The other issue which I would have wanted us to discuss, but we didn't have time, was what are the areas of overlap or differences between decolonial approaches to sociolinguistics and Southern approaches to sociolinguistics, and to some extent, indigenous approaches to sociolinguistics. You begin to touch on that when you argued for the importance of comparative approaches to some of these debates. Because it's possible that how decolonial approaches play themselves out in the US, for example, may be very different from how they play themselves out in Eastern Europe or in South America, for example. And currently, I'm increasingly interested in exploring the role of what Molefe Asante calls Afrocentricity on decoloniality. How does Afrocentricity shape one's views towards decoloniality or Southern approaches towards sociolinguistics? And what is interesting about reading what Molefe Asante is saying is that it provides you with another perspective towards these similar issues, where, for example, for him, the classifications which are central to what he calls the Euro-American Academy might not be very appropriate or relevant to Africa and all other contexts. So the thinking that I'm engaged in at the moment is to say it's important to read scholarship in other disciplines and to see how they are addressing similar issues. So, for example, in volume 2 of our series, for the first time, we will have contributions by Ngugi wa Thiong'o with a partial response by the Senegalese scholar Bashir Diane, and then there will be Jean Komarov, and there will be Walter Minolo, and Catherine Walsh, etc., with the foreword written by Lewis Gordon. So it will be interesting to get all those individuals. And then the challenge in the introduction is how to navigate all those people who have been saying similar things, but you hardly find them citing each other or quoting each other's work. Right. So that is really what would be quite interesting. For example, the debate between Ngugi wa Thiong'o and Bashir Suleiman is fascinating to read. And the comments by Molefe Asante on decoloniality, which don't come into the mainstream of academic discussion, are also very interesting, because I think they will ultimately enrich what we are doing. And I completely agree with Sally that about the relationship between language and communication, that it is language which is the consequence of communication, not the other way around. And in that we should all keep playing with the idea of what will the linguistics look like if it were established, even from your own local context. How would it look like? All right. Anyway, I should say thank you very much to everybody. And I should hand over now, I think, to Bishop.